Hello, my name is Jack Thomas, and the unit I chose to present on is Chapter 8 in the textbook, also known as Understanding the Entity Relationship Data Model. I'm kind of going to talk about how you can use an ERD for a lot of things. How to create one, first of all, if you're new to creating ERDs, what systems to use to do that, and the steps to go through to end up building a foundation for your structural data. So I guess we're just going to get right into it. And so first, what is an ERD model? If you look on your right, that is the end result that we want to eventually get to in an ERD model. It can look different depending on what software you use to create your ERD, but I'll first start with defining what an ERD model is. An ERD model is also known as an entity relationship diagram model, and it is classified as a graphical representation that depicts relationships among people, objects, places, concepts, or events in an information technology system. And so basically what it does for companies or people that are trying to design certain things is it just helps everyone understand the foundation of data and information that you might be storing within your database. And this might help you navigate your system a lot easier. You can kind of just go back in your ERD, look at how different relationships connect and different entities connect. So there is two main concepts when it comes to ER modeling or ERD modeling. And the first one is entities. So entities are defined as tables that hold specific information within an ERD. And on the right here is kind of an example, or at least one of the examples that you might take in an ERD, depending, again, on the software you use. It might look a little different. But there's a couple entities. There's a primary key, which is kind of it's the main entity that the other entities are going to be based off of. So that primary key, which is the student ID, is going to eventually have names, date of birth, majors, other entities that connect with it and have relationships. And then segueing into the next step is relationships, which is the second concept of an ER model. And basically, a relationship is just defined as the association or interaction between entities. And on the right, you'll see it again, and we'll go into more detail about how to graph or how to draw out an entity relationship later on. But this is kind of a dumbed down basic version of what it is. The student is enrolling into a course, shows the relationship between the course and the student, kind of showing how you might go about that process and how those things connect. And so types of entities and relationships, this is where things can get a little tricky, but an entity type, there's a couple entity types, and I didn't list all of them, but I listed a lot of them. But strong entities, which are entities that exist independently and do not rely on any other entities to exist within the system. There's the weak entities that do rely on those other entities, normally the primary keys, like I said, with the student ID, and they rely on those strong entities to be able to function within your system. And then there's the associative entities, which represent many-to-many relationships between two or more relationships. And I'll go into that in a second, talking about relationship types. A one-to-one exists when each record in one entity is related to exactly one record in another entity. Now, this is a less common version of a relationship because there's not going to be a lot of things in your system that only relate to one of the other entities. So one entity, it's normally one-to-many, which is the next one, which exists when each record in one entity can be related to multiple records in another entity. And it's nice to have these one-to-many relationships. And again, they're as noted in there, it's most common. And it's the most common because you want to have a database that can flow well. You want to have a database that can connect many things at the same time, because having a one-to-one relationship can kind of throw off a balance, but it's also used and is very important for unique situations. But then the last one is many-to-many, which is just it exists when each record in one entity can be related to multiple records in another entity. And this requires an associative entity, which is, again, above, represented by many-to-many relationships between two or more relationships. So very specific, and also not as common, but can be common if you are designing a database a certain type of way. The relationship that entities and cardinality have. So on the visual standpoint, when you're designing your ERDs, you're going to have a couple different ways that you can go about it. But normally, different relationships or entities or cardinalities, is what's on the right, are used with specific shapes. So the rectangular shapes on the left kind of symbolize what an entity is in your diagram, and you'll see later on, I think you've seen so far, but you'll see later on what that entity looks like in a completed ERD. And so on the right is a cardinality kind of visual associated with the one-to-many like I was talking about, and they call that the crow's foot notation, just because of these little feet that are represented on the ends of the lines. Those are going to connect your different relationships and your different entities, and overall kind of establish the relationship that you might have between those entities. So if you're new to ERDs, there's a couple places to create an ERD. I've only experimented with a couple before. I really like Draw SQL and I like ERD Plus, and I've used DVD or DB Diagram before, but it's not my favorite. But I do recommend kind of exploring the different ways and the different websites that you can go to create ERDs that make things extremely easy, and they might look similar but a little different at the same time, but varying on which website you go to. But it is nice to explore just because you never know which one you're going to like more. So now I'm going to be talking about the different steps that you need to take to go about designing an ERD. And the first one's pretty simple, establishing a foundation for your entities, and determining the entities in your ERD. So first, you can see on the right the different entities, entity A and entity B, and how that relationship will eventually come together. But establishing what those entities are going to be is the main focal point of the ERD. If you don't have that, it's literally in the name of the diagram, entity relationship diagram. If you don't have an entity, you don't have a strong entity that you can build off of, then you will not be able to go about this process. And if you can, it might not be as strong of a process as you want, or you might not have as great of results. So first is determining your entities, and it must possess a set of one or more attributes that uniquely identify it. If you have an entity that can only have one attribute or one good attribute, then it's really not going to go far. It's not going to expand your system. And then the best way to go about identifying entities is understanding the system's desires in terms of capturing, storing, and producing specific information. How you're going to store your data is very important. And so if you cannot establish what you want to capture, you might be capturing data that you don't want overall, and that would just lead you down a rabbit hole and you're going to get lost. So it's visually represented by a rectangular shape. I talked about shapes being a representation of the different types of things within the ERD. So entities, relationships, attributes, as you can see, I'll get to later. Ovals are attributes, sometimes diamonds are relationships, and this can also vary between softwares, but most of the time the entities are going to be rectangles just like that, and they can change depending on what entity you have. Step 2 in designing the ERD is to add attributes to each entity. So we talked about in the last slide, being able to establish different attributes to your entities that are strong. And so attributes are commonly visually represented by ovals, like I talked before, but attributes further define the information being stored and better help viewers understand the grouping of the information. So if someone's looking at your ERD and they want to understand how your system works, it's really easy for them to read it. The better your attributes are and the more specific your attributes are. It's better not to overcomplicate things and to keep things simple, but also don't make them simple enough to where people can't understand where your system wants to go. Step 3 is simply defining the relationship between the entities. And we talked about this with cardinality. And this on the right side is kind of a better representation of how cardinality is going to be represented in your ERD. It's not going to be spaced like this, obviously, but this picture, this image defines how you might see a relationship be associated with a different entity and how that relationship might pair those entities together. And so defining the relationship between entities is normally assigned verbs. So the entity normally assigns verbs, as you see. You see born in, birthplace of. Some other examples might be assign, associate, track, provide. You want to find a key verb to kind of be or act as a middle point between the different entities that you have, to act as that nice relationship. And they're used to document the interaction between two entities. So we kind of already knew this. You want a relationship to document the relationship that you might have. And so it's pretty straightforward, but it's just know that you might want to simplify things using verbs, keep things simple, like I said before, very easy to do, but it's also very easy to overcomplicate. But if you keep little verbs like born in or assign or associate, you can understand how that relationship is built between the two entities. Step 4, and the second to last step in the designing of the ERD system, is adding cardinality to every relationship in the ER diagram. Talked about cardinality a couple times, but again, drilling it in, there's a couple different types that you can have. There's one to many, and each is represented by a different symbol in the ERD. Obviously, these are easy ways to go about it. I love using the crow's foot notation. There are different ways to go about doing this as well. You can use different symbols, different ways to kind of document what your relationship is, but crow's foot's very simple, very easy to read. And most people use crow's foot. So if you're going to use crow's foot, then you can have a common ground between people trying to understand what your diagram means and what your diagram is trying to put across. And I bolded it here. Some symbols are very important. You mark something wrong, then your relationship is just completely destroyed. It doesn't make any sense to put many where something might be one-to-one, and that can really mess up your system in the long run and lead you to down the road of many mistakes. And the final step of designing an ERD is to finish and save your ERD. I do recommend saving in between each session. I know it can be a little tedious to make ERDs, so you don't want to lose it in the process. You don't want to do a lot of work, do hours of work, and then it all be lost because your computer crashes or the system crashes or your web browser crashes. You don't want to be that person that loses all your progress. I've been that person before. It doesn't feel good. Having to start all over, you don't have any saved progress, can be a little bit of a pain. But explore and learn about different ERD creation sites. I talked about a couple before, 7 before, and those are great websites to use. They're easy to use, they're easy to navigate, but also learn and explore how to use each different one because everyone likes a different one. And the more you use a site or a specific site, the easier it's going to be to build those ERDs, and the quicker it will be to build those ERDs. And importing files can be a little confusing sometimes. Trying to save it onto your laptop and open it up again, sometimes it doesn't save the way you want it to. Sometimes it saves in a different design. So learn how different softwares save your data. And then make sure designs are saved throughout the process of creating an ERD. Like I said, save, save, save. And if you don't save, you have a chance of losing your progress. So save as it right when you open the file. Continue to click that save button on the top left. Every website has it, or most do at least. So I do recommend saving it throughout the entire process. And I've built a couple entity relationship diagrams myself. So some tips I recommend for creating an ERD is keep entities and relationships simple. I've said it also again earlier. Keep things simple because you do not want to overcomplicate things, get in your own head. Then things get a little crazy and all over the place, and it becomes really hard to read your system or your diagram. Name everything properly. Like I said with the verbs, for relationships, it is very important to use specific verbiage, correct labeling, because if you don't, things can get a little bit hectic and there can be a lot of clutter. Make clean and consistent designs. Sometimes when designing ERDs, you don't understand how big you're actually going to expand your diagram, and that can lead to some bigger issues later down the road with cleanliness and consistency. And you really want to space things out, because if you don't, they're going to start overlapping. Your relationships are going to overlap. Your entities are going to overlap. You might add something later down the road to an entity and associate some sort of attribute or something, and you don't have space for it because you've made your relationship diagram so big. And then regularly review and refine your design. It's nice to review because, similar to coding, if you mess one thing up, it can destroy your entire ERD. There are scenarios where that does not happen, and you can just kind of refine and tweak your ERD system or part of it, and it won't mess up much. But I do recommend refining your design as you keep going. Look back. It's really important to look back, and if you don't, you can go down a rabbit hole and go down a road of a specific entity that you were really digging into, and it can kind of lead to some issues down the road. So I recommend regularly reviewing and refining your design. Lastly, I want to show some examples of finished ERDs. On the left isn't necessarily an ERD, but you could technically classify it as an ERD in certain systems. More in the coding world, the left side is, and the right side was what I'm used to and what I've used. So this is what it will look like when it's finished. There's a lot of information on the left, and it's a little easier to read on the right, and that's what a lot of normal softwares will do. So that's a great example. If you keep your information simple on the right, it's a lot easier to read. It's a lot easier for other people to read, and your system just flows a lot better. And so that is creating an ERD system and the steps to go about doing that and what it is. So thank you for listening. And here are my sources.